Good morning, everyone. My name is Elijah Kipchumba. I am winding my PhD at Trinity College Dublin, and today I'm presenting a project I was working on in Uganda for a couple of years before joining the PhD. This is more of an intervention that targets people with disabilities, and we are going to ask ourselves whether a program that targets people with disabilities, especially the ultra-poor graduation program, which is a multifaceted intervention that gives people assets and at the same time extensive hand-holding for a period of up to 2 years, what happens to them after they complete the program. And this is the evidence that is going to, that I'll be presenting today. So to kind of lay some context into this is that we know that people with disabilities are overrepresented among the poorest. And if we look at the graph on the right, here we see that there's a constant gap or disability penalty among people with disabilities in the context of Uganda, but this is the same case across the world. Especially in developing countries where people with disabilities generally are not included in being economically active or doing work. And the reason why this is the case is that people with disabilities not only face structural challenges because they are excluded in their economic lives, and this makes them more vulnerable to poverty. On the same side is that the people with disabilities usually have societal attitudes that prevents them from taking economic activities or engaging in the social life. So when we economically empower people with disabilities to take up occupations, does it alleviate the poverty, and at the same time, does it drive the social inclusion in addressing the negative attitudes toward people with disabilities? So I'm going to speak to that question specifically. So as I mentioned before, this is a simple randomized control trial that has been adopted from BRAC's program, that is the ultra-poor graduation program. We test them against people, we give it to people with disabilities, and people without disabilities, compare the differences among them versus people who did not, who are eligible for the program but did not get the program. And as I mentioned, it's a multifaceted that spans like almost 2 years, and it includes assets, training and savings promotion, as well as tentative efforts to address sensitization about issues for people with disabilities in a way to reduce information gaps as well as drive empathy towards people with disabilities. And to highlight the results that I get is that people with disabilities, after participating in this program, do take up productive occupations. For example, they switch from being casual laborers to being doing their own farm work, which is more paying or has more economic benefits. But this does not address the social exclusion. Instead, we find that actually people with disabilities are subjected to more negative attitudes in the society, which can be counterintuitive. We'll try and provide some subjective evidence for this, why this might be the case. To go into the nitty-gritties of this is that we do randomized control trials that involves around 3,400 households from 8 districts in Uganda, and we do a cluster randomized control trial. And I'm going to compare treatment and versus control, and here I'll just look at the differential impacts for people with disabilities versus those without disabilities. So that's the only differences that I'm going to be comparing today. To get into the results, a bit of it by just looking at the beta coefficients between the wild estimate between those with disabilities and versus those without disabilities, what we can see is that the probability of engaging in economic activities do increase among people with disabilities versus those, as well as those without disability. And we find kind of large effect in the probability of engaging in working in their own farm, and they're kind of substituting away from working for pay, which is kind of more precarious in the context of Uganda. When we look at the social exclusion side of things, people without disabilities have more social participation or engaging in social activities, but there is no response in people without disabilities within that extent. And we kind of try and understand what could be the case, and we look at the social attitudes towards people with disabilities. On one angle, we look at, this is like, in the first case, this is like blaming people with disabilities on their inaction, or kind of saying that the people with disabilities are poor because they don't work hard enough. And on the second dimension, this is an index that is kind of constructing to say people with disabilities are demanding too much from the society. And we kind of see that those without disabilities are kind of blaming people with disabilities more and saying that they are demanding too much from the society. We don't see that much changes in the attitudes among people with disabilities themselves. And why is this counterintuitive result? We look at probably, there are two kind of explanations. Either by people with disabilities getting more economically empowered, then there could be some jealousy in the background going on, and that it's kind of backlashing against people with disabilities. When we look at that, we don't find much more evidence that people are backlashing against people with disabilities. Instead, we find a kind of a biased belief update by looking at in clusters where people with disabilities were not working or were not engaged in their farming, which is kind of the intuition here is that if you empower people with disabilities to engage in activities that are being done by, yes, thank you, by those people who are a bit richer in the society, by enabling them to, enabling the people with disability to engage in this richer occupation, then those with, or the stigmatizers in this case, kind of become more negative towards them by saying, okay, we closing the gap between us and people with disabilities, and therefore we don't want them kind of to come into our space, because we have known people with disabilities to kind of being a distant from us, so we need to maintain that distance to them. So that is the kind of the story why we need to say that, okay, we have to maintain a distance with people with disabilities. They are poor, they should stay that way. Us without disabilities, we are richer, we need to stay that way. So that would be the essence why you kind of see a negative updating towards attitudes towards people with disabilities. And to kind of summarize, although I went a little bit fast, I thought maybe my 8 minutes is a bit needed. What we see is that when we do economic empowerment activities, we usually don't look at how the beneficiaries respond, or how people of different characteristics respond towards economic empowerment activities. One side is that, for sure, when you do social protection or alternative interventions to kind of address poverty, we rarely look at what is the response for recipients versus non-recipients, or those who are eligible versus those who are not eligible. In this case, we just compare the differences between people with disabilities versus those without disabilities. Well, how does the economic inclusion or economic empowerment respond, and how does the social exclusion as well respond to interventions? And in this case, we kind of find that there is some strong economic empowerment or economic inclusion response to this large intervention, but it does not address the prejudice or the negative attitudes towards people with disabilities. And why this might be the case, it's because people with disabilities engage in productive activities, but the people without disabilities, who are the stigmatizer in this case, do not appreciate this power, the barriers against people with disabilities. Instead, they kind of conform to kind of the distance between people with disabilities versus non-people with disabilities. And that is kind of rationalizing why negative attitudes towards people with disabilities could be reinforced in this case. And thank you. That is my presentation.